I'm Judith Alfrey. I work for CADU, and the focus of my work is very much on historic buildings and places, what makes them special, caring for them, protecting them. And so what I wanted to do this afternoon was take a short walk around Abergynolwyn and try and share what I think makes it a special and interesting place. And I'm aware that the people in my eventual audience will know more about it than I do, but I hope that nevertheless you will be indulgent in hearing my reflections on the place. So I wanted as well then to start with just a bit of background, and in fact actually I wanted to start with a quotation which comes from the Aberystwyth Observer newspaper in November 1880. And I found this and I thought it was just lovely. So, Abergynolwyn is one of those places which has risen phoenix-like during the past few years to meet the exigencies of trade, and where only a comparatively short time ago there were but few houses scattered over an area of several miles. There is now a flourishing village inhabited by an industrious and contented people who toil daily in the quarries nearby and thus pass a happy and uneventful life among some of the most rugged scenery that Wales possesses. So never mind the fact that only 2 years ago the local newspapers had been full of what a kind of unruly place Abergynolwyn was, with where apparently marauding mobs were sort of roaming the land, and there was like kind of mob rule, and never mind the fact that working in the quarries was was a dangerous occupation. Newspapers are also full of horrible accidents, and also never mind the fact that working in the quarries was a very uncertain occupation too. That they were subject to economic fluctuations, and I don't think that it would have been a happy and contented life particularly. But nevertheless, I think the newspaper was right in what he said about Abergynolwyn rising phoenix-like, because actually it is somewhere that's remarkable for having grown and taken the form that it now has in a very, very short space of time. It was a very small place to start with, it was just a scatter of farms and an agricultural settlement really, and then there was a little flurry of activity when the slate quarry first opened in the 1840s. But then really it was from the 1860s, over just 2 decades, that it took the form that it now has, and that's actually pretty remarkable rapid growth for to go from sort of nothing almost to something. After that, not a lot happened, it didn't really change very much, and I think that's one of the things that makes it really interesting, because it means that now, more than, well, what is that, it's 150, 160 years later, isn't it? We can still look at Abergynolwyn and we can actually see that mid-19th century industrial community. We can see it really clearly, and we can also see where it came from. And so we're going to set off in this direction. I think this is really represents where Abergynolwyn started from, really, as a settlement. So we're in Pandy Square, or on the edge of Pandy Square, and there was a farm called Pandy in the early 19th century, which we think don't know how long it had been there, but probably since at least the 18th century. And there were various farm buildings associated with that in this general area, and I think that the white building there with the little nesting holes in the gable end is one of those farm buildings. The others have been rebuilt and changed over time, but and one of the reasons why they've changed is because in the later 19th century there was actually a slate dressing mill here, which apparently made slates for use in schools. So it's actually a really nice location to understand something of how an agricultural economy changed into an industrial one, but the one never completely wiped out the evidence of the other. So you can still, I think, standing here, you can still get a sense of it being an arrangement of farm buildings and this old farm. So in looking at the buildings, one of the ways in which we can actually distinguish the earlier ones from the later is actually the way that they're built and what they're built of. And the pre-1860 buildings are built with fieldstone not quarried stone, just with boulders. And they also tend to be to have been lime washed. So we can see in the one with the beautiful wisteria, we can actually see the raw material, which is the stones, the quite rough field stones. Then you can actually see what that probably should look like with the white lime wash over it. And that was just the traditional way of finishing a building, and really until the second half of the 19th century. And then in front of me now we can actually see the post-1860s building material, which is this sawn and cut slate. And actually what's really lovely here is that someone has taken a great deal of trouble to actually cut this slate wall over some boulders, which presumably were just too big to move out of the way. So they've gone to a lot of trouble. But in that little wall you can actually see the distinction between the types of building material that were available for use locally. So these are the main buildings of Pandy Square, as you know. We know that these were already here by about 1860, and my best guess is that they were probably built as part of that first phase of the development of the quarry in the 1840s. And the reason I think that is that they look very traditional, because they are built in this traditional way of using field stone, and then with a very thick coat of what would originally at least have been lime wash. So that's quite a traditional way of doing things, but it's a non-traditional block of buildings, because if you imagine a small agricultural community, there would be no call to have a terrace of houses, and you can see from this it was built as a terrace. It was designed and conceived as a row of several houses, and actually in a rural context that's pretty unusual. So that already suggests that there's a kind of economic organisation behind these buildings, which tends to make you think, it's something to do with industry. So here, in this case, obviously the slate. It's actually an L-shaped block, which is not actually that easy to build in a way, because you've got to kind of manage the roof to go around the corner. And what they've done here is they've sort of hipped this top gable end. So again, that's actually, this is actually quite a sophisticated piece of building design. It looks quite simple, and they're small, they're small houses, but it represents quite a bit of investment in the building process, and it's obviously been very, very well organised, because it's all designed and built as one. There are no apparent joins between the individual buildings. I should just say as well that you can see the nature of the original building material really clearly in the chimneys, and that would be normal practice really would be to lime wash the walls, because the lime wash it's a weather coat. It protects the building and stops the ingress of damp, because you didn't really need to do that on the chimneys, so they would have been left as raw stone. Okay. So although it's changed quite a lot, the Railway Inn actually is yet another reminder of that, the agricultural origins of the settlement here, because we know that this was actually a farm. We know it was a farm because it's marked as such on the map, but the other reason why we know it's a farm is because it's actually got farm buildings. So the range there obviously is the barn, and possibly other animal accommodation associated with this farm. The original farmhouse became a pub, I think probably in the 1840s. I think it was called the Red Lion, or some sort of lion, and then it obviously got renamed the Railway Inn after the Talyllyn Railway arrived here in the 1860s, and it's changed a lot. It's been extended at some point, and then obviously more recently the windows have all been changed. So it's harder to detect the early origins of this building, but one of the clues to its traditional origins is that it's actually got a slightly asymmetrical facade. So if you imagine the original building spanning between the big chimney there and that one there, you'll see that the space, it looks as if the door's in the middle, but you'll see that the space to either side of the door is not actually the same. So what that tells us is that one of these spaces was actually the principal room with the bigger fireplace, and the other one was a lesser room. And traditional building almost always reflects on the outside the way that the space is used on the inside. So we can see, and then also the size of the chimney is another clue that probably this was, I'm guessing, someone who's been inside here might be able to prove me wrong, but I would guess that that would have been the main room. And so, and then you imagine the wall there, a smaller room on that side of the door. And hold that thought, because actually we're going to see that same idea, we're going to see it again as we wander around the village. Right. So these two buildings here are more examples of well, either the pre-industrial settlement or more probably the very first phases of its growth as an industrial village. But these two are very definitely traditional in character, and the one on the right in particular, again you can see the field stone, very rough field stone, sort of rounded, and you can, and I think it's originally that would have been lime washed. I'm sure it's just Sandtex or something now, but it gives the same visual effect anyway. And you can also see again here the arrangement that I was talking about before, where it's actually not quite symmetrical. So there's a bigger, or one of the rooms is bigger than the other, and that's expressed outside. The building on the left, I don't really know what has happened to this, and if anyone does, it would be nice to hear. So you can see it looks as if it was built as two, because the lower courses of stone that's continuous, but then above the first foot or so, it's all cut slate. So that's much later, quite a bit later anyway. So whether this building wasn't finished and then it got finished in the 1860s, or whether it collapsed or was rebuilt in some way, but it's actually quite a mix of materials, and it's got quite a complicated history, and it would be lovely to know a bit more about that. While we're standing here, we might as well just say a word about the Wesleyan chapel there. So that building, the building that we're looking at, was built in 1870. I think it actually says on the date stone itself, I think it says 1835. So that's not an 1835 building, because you can see from the use of building materials and what have you that it is a building of 1870. But there must have been a chapel here before that, and what they've done is they've commemorated their own history in the date stone. And in fact the building beyond it is, again, that's made of the field stone, so I think that might be something that was associated with an earlier building on the site. So in a way, that building sort of encapsulates the shift from an agricultural community to an industrial one, and the rebuilding of the building, presumably on a much bigger scale, actually it tells us something about the way that the place was growing. While we're here, we might as well also just notice this pair of buildings here. These are also pre-1860, and they are actually also, they've had, I would think, quite a checkered building history, because again it's a mixture of the rough fieldstone and cut slate, so possibly just lots of repair and remodelling. And then the boundary wall here in itself is a bit of a mixture of the two materials, but it's got this really nice use of quartz for the copings, and that crops up not only elsewhere in the village but actually also elsewhere in the valley, and I don't know when that would have been done. It's possibly not very old, but it's very, very distinctive and characterful, and definitely one of the things that gives a kind of sense of place. It's lovely. Okay, so really from now on for the rest of the walk we are definitely in the domain of the Abergynolwyn Slate Company and of William McConnell, who had bought the quarry and the land in 1864. He was, probably know, he was a Manchester industrialist. His background was in the textile industry, and I presume he just wanted to diversify. So he bought this as kind of going concern, or just about to going concern, in 1864, and he moved really fast, because a year later he was promoting the Talyllyn Railway and also beginning the development of the village. So these houses here, this whole row, it was built between 1865 and 1868, I think. On the face of it, again, you might think that these are traditional cottages, but but really this is not at all, this is just not at all a traditional development. And I think the thing that really gives it away for starters is the fact that I think it's 2 rows, isn't it? I think there's a break somewhere down it, but it's a really long development, and you can see that it was all conceived and planned in one go, because it's essentially the same kind of house, just repeated and repeated and repeated. But no one could do that unless they actually had quite a lot of money to invest in building. It's obviously the traditional pattern of building is you sort of build for yourself, but this is definitely a different model, and on a much bigger scale than Pandy Square. So you can see again the difference in scale between the early phases of quarrying and the later is just phenomenal, and you can see it here laid out really, really clearly. The other big difference is that we're no longer using the field stone. This is all slate from the quarry. Presumably the bits that were not much used for anything else makes perfectly good building stone. The buildings here, these ones in particular, have been changed. I think they've had larger windows put in at some point. But what I'd like to point out, and we can see this repeatedly as we go down the row, is we've actually where they still relate to older traditions, is they've still got that asymmetrical plan, because if you look at them you'll see that the space between the door and the window on one side is much smaller than it is on the other. But actually what you'll also see is that this terrace actually takes the form of a series of pairs. So each pair is actually symmetrical in itself, so that asymmetrical facade is kind of handed, if you see what I mean. And that again, it's quite a sort of small thing, but it suggests that these were laid. These were, they were designed. There were probably paper drawings for these to actually sort of get that to work out. And you'll see that all the way down the row, that it's just got this alternating sort of rhythm of spaces in each of the houses. I just wanted to stop here briefly, really, to look at this house here, because it's still got its original sash window. So in this one here we can get a really good sense of what these might have all looked like originally, and you can see that the huge difference really between the original form and the later alteration. It's really nice to see that still. I should have said perhaps that this idea of the single-storey cottage, I mean, there are very few of these actually locally, and largely because probably there were more and they just haven't really survived. But we think that probably there would have been single-storey cottages for farm labourers in this area. But I think that it's possible that William McConnell, who had an architect working for him, designing houses here, he may very well have been taking some of his ideas from what had already been built for the slate quarry settlements in North Wales. And in the area of Bethesda, which is on the Penryn estate, there are lots and lots of cottages like this that were built by the Penryn estate for their slate workers, for slate quarry workers. And I wonder whether actually that's where he sort of got the idea from. Also the next row, all part of the same development, but actually very, very subtly different. I think that they're probably a little bit bigger. The roof pitch is maybe slightly steeper, so they've got a little bit more height to them. And unlike this row, these ones all seem to have been built with porches from the beginning. So what we're starting to see here, so we know that this was all effectively one phase of building, but there are these little distinctions between them. And I think what we're starting to see is building to match the kind of hierarchy of the social hierarchy of the community, which relates to the sort of economic structure of working in the quarry. So housing would be provided at probably very slightly different rents for people who earned a little bit more. And so I don't think it's that that it isn't just to do with these ones perhaps being a little bit later than these ones. It is actually to do with building for a very specific community and matching the kind of building to the kind of people and the means that they would have to pay their rent. So while we're here, we'll have a quick look at the Independent Chapel, Court Independent Chapel, built in 1878, and I don't think it had a predecessor, so I think this was all new in 1878. It's what we might expect. It's built using slate, but there is actually some sort of non-local stone used here for the dressings of the windows and the door, and the doorways, which again is it suggests that the resources that were at the command of the independent congregation here. What I really like about this, actually, from a design point of view, is that it was traditional for a chapel to have two doors where space permitted, and I don't really know, but I assume that was one for the men and one for the women. But what I really like here is that they've actually managed to get the two doors, as it were, into one doorway. So they've got this sort of symmetrical Gothic design, but it still actually enables them to respect their own tradition of having the paired entries. So Capel Jerusalem marks the end of Hail Llanegrin and sort of bookends this extraordinary terrace that we've just been looking at. This was built in 1866, and you can see it's definitely got the two-door arrangement. I think that probably all I'd really want to say about this is that we've now seen all three of the chapels in the village, and they're all really big buildings, which accommodate quite a lot of people on a Sunday morning, and they're all really beautifully built as well, and very sort of solid. And I think that the buildings themselves, although they're all now, they're no longer chapels, are they? They've all been converted, I think, haven't they? But they still stand as testimony to the power and strength of the nonconformist tradition in rural Wales, actually, but particularly in industrial Wales in the 19th century. And it's just, I think, a really important reminder of another aspect of life in a community like this, where people actually, they probably really cared about theology. They knew which denomination that was theirs, and so we got three representing three different denominations, and that suggests a very sort of lively nonconformist culture. And it's good that despite the conversion, the buildings, you can still read them for what they were. They're still very obviously the chapels, and it's also good that they've still got things like their massive gate posts and the cast iron railings. Okay, just pausing here to point out the remnants of the slate pillar fence here, and then if you look through there you can see the return of it. There's obviously quite a lot of that sort of thing around here. The fields just outside the village are made of it, but it's lovely to see a little bit of it actually in the village. And then also, while we're here, just to draw attention to the backs of the terrace that we've just been looking at. They've obviously got the very long front gardens, but just yards at the back, but all still got their very distinctive little outbuildings, which again, there's lovely character on this back lane because of those. No, can't see anymore, but that is, I think, particularly interesting about Abergynolwyn is that the railway actually came into the village, and there was a branch of it that came down this back lane, and I presume originally it probably brought the building supplies to enable the buildings to be built, but it survived and was actually then used to take away what was euphemistically called the night soil from these back buildings, which would have housed presumably coal sheds, but also, and more significantly in this instance, the outside toilets. And I don't know of anywhere else in Wales that actually had a railway to provide that kind of basic service. So it does actually rather suggest that William McConnell was actually quite interested in the welfare of his tenants, and actually sort of designed that in to for the sort of hygiene and cleanliness of the village. It's really interesting, and as I say, as far as I know, it probably is unique. This is actually the second phase of the McConnell period of building. I think this row is 1868, I think, for this one. And we can see straight away, this is a very different kind of building altogether, really. For one thing, we've got it into 2 stories. They're still quite small. It's essentially a sort of, 1 unit on each floor. But they are very different in appearance and character from the first row. But as I was saying then, I think that the difference probably reflects, it's a kind of social stratification, not necessarily a development in architecture, because they're only a year later, and it doesn't make sense for some radical architectural change to have taken place in just a year. We do know that William McConnell engaged an architect called James Stephens, who, like him, came from Manchester. And although this, in some ways, it's quite a, it is in its own way, it's quite a traditional terrace, fairly straightforward. But it does have some features where you can see that probably has been an architect at work. And the most distinctive feature is actually the way that the roof and the eaves actually overhang. That's not a traditional way of going on, or at least not to have it in quite so exaggerated. And it does give these buildings very particular character. You can see it even more extreme on the next row, which is again part of the same development. And from here, you actually get a really great view, right under the eaves of that very, very generous overhang. Useful to have an overhang of some sort because it throws the water off the walls, and as we all know, it rains a lot here. But you do not need to have such an exaggerated one. So that's actually a kind of architectural conceit to give the buildings a particular aesthetic character. So still part of the same development, 1868 to 9, almost certainly the work of James Stephens. And as we've already been looking at the overhanging eaves, and the main distinction here between this row and the one we've just been looking at is that this one is bigger again. The ceiling heights are much greater, and you can see that there's actually a full upper story, whereas here the upstairs windows are tucked in right underneath the eaves. So, as I've said before, I think these are built for a slightly different grade of worker, and it would actually be really interesting to know, to do some study of the census, to know actually who did live in these houses and whether the architectural distinctions are in fact borne out in practice. But that's certainly what it looks like. So essentially what we've got here is a sort of like a cross-section through the social structure of an industrial community, and because it was all one industry, it's it's very clear to see and understand. So the other thing that marks this row out is that it's got more architectural embellishment. So the first thing to notice is it's got these pilaster strips, which are the vertical projecting strips that articulate the facade. So what they're doing is dividing the row into pairs, each one divided by these pilaster strips, and it actually comes from a kind of classical tradition of building. So it's quite suave, really, to have that. And then the other thing that they've got is this sill band, which is not actually quite continuous. So I suspect it probably was once, and it ran all the way along as a continuous strip below the first floor windows. So you can see it quite clearly here. So what's going on here is that the facade has been divided vertically by the pilasters and then horizontally by this sill band. And there's no need for any of that. It is pure decoration, but it actually does give this terrace quite a strong character. It's quite a sort of subtle distinction, but a really nice one. And then also here again, just a really lovely example of surviving boundary wall, which we tend to call this cock and hen, this kind of coping where you get a tall one and like a kind of castellated effect. But it's really nice, and also just noticing the lovely slate steps as well, obviously the product of the quarry. Okay, so we've stopped here mainly actually to look at the back of Tan and Bryn, which is the last of the McConnell developments and it's 1870. But before we do that, I also just couldn't resist having a look at this wall here, because you can see here we've got the field stones, we've got the split slate, and then we've got the kind of cock and hen arrangement, but instead of actually having it in the castellated effect, they've actually filled in the spaces with quartz, and I think it's a very minor detail in a way, but it's really distinctive and characterful, and it's just a lovely thing. So the back of Tan and Bryn is also really distinctive, because we've got this very extraordinary arrangement of the projecting wings to the houses. And although this is all happening on a very, very small scale, there aren't all that many houses here, and you know, you can't not be aware of the very rural context in which all this is happening. But that street is actually, it's very kind of urban, and that type of house that's a very, very urban house design. So they're designed, they're double depth, they're quite tall, and they've got these rear wings. And if you look at, I don't know, housing in any city or major town, 19th century housing has that design, and I dare say that the architect actually took that design from what was going on in Manchester, and it's just a very extraordinary and remarkable thing to find this very, very urban house type in such a rural context. And it's a reminder really of the relationship between an urban and an industrial and an urban culture. But also I think that the whole place here is a reminder that industry and an urban culture never entirely replace the rural, and that they're mixed here in a really interesting way. So the back lane for Tan and Bryn, the railway also went along here to collect the night soil, and as I say, probably to deliver coal, and maybe originally to deliver the building materials. Everything that could be made out of slate was made out of slate here, and I think, and you know, I might be proved wrong, but I think that the post there by the gate is actually for a washing line, and there are one or two of them dotted around the village, aren't there? And again, maybe other slate quarry communities have those, but I haven't seen them anywhere else. And again, it's quite a minor feature, but a very characterful one, and one that somehow takes us really close to the people, you know, who lived here. I just think it's a really lovely detail. And then one more thing here is just this this relationship of the two building materials. This much too big to be used for building and too big to be taken away, and so they've just built this shed around it, and again, that's a very quirky but really charming detail. Okay, so it's the last stopping point on this walk really is Tan and Bryn, and this actually I think sort of sums up really nicely all of the distinctive features of the McConnell period of development here, all laid out and built in 1870, I believe, and very definitely and very obviously planned. It's about as straight a line as it could be, but even though, and obviously it's without saying it's terraced housing, so again we've got that, you know, someone taking control of the building process, someone with a fair amount to spend on building, and almost certainly again using an architect. It's got the same, we can see that same overhanging eaves detail, at least at this end of the row and on this side. Again, we can see that there are subtle differences between the houses, so smaller ones at that end, slightly bigger ones here, and bigger again here, and the difference is in height, and in the number of first floor windows. So this actually does encapsulate all of those elements of the industrial community really nicely. And then finally, something we haven't really talked about is that we talked about the chapels. I haven't actually mentioned the school, but the other thing that you would need for a kind of complete community is you need shops, and I think that the building there where there's brick between the two windows and a continuous lintel above them, and then possibly this one here where it looks as if possibly a shop front has been taken out here. I think these might both have been shops. I'm guessing, I'm just reading what the building is telling me. And I know that there are other buildings around the village that were once shops. Again, it seems, to us now, it seems extraordinary that there would be 3 chapels and many shops in a relatively small community. But it would have been a very self-contained place, and it would have needed it would have had to have everything that it needed to sort of sustain itself, really. I think these are actually the only buildings in the village that are listed, and this is a very, very special. It is a very special row. They're really beautiful. They're really beautifully designed, and they just capture that essence of the history of the place, as it took shape as a sort of fully fledged industrial community in the mid to late 19th century. And I hope that I've drawn your attention to things that perhaps you haven't necessarily noticed. But really, what I wanted to do is just try and share what I think is really interesting and special about this place. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it. Thank you.